Commander Sarah Chun adjusted her civilian clothes as she walked through Denver International Airport's busy terminal. After 15 years as a Navy SEAL and decorated pilot, she had learned to blend into crowds. Her short black hair was styled simply, and her casual jeans and sweater gave no hint of her military background. The only signs of her training were her alert eyes that constantly scanned her surroundings and the confident way she moved through the crowded space. Sarah was heading home to San Diego after visiting her elderly parents in Colorado. Her father, a retired Marine, had finally agreed to move into assisted living after her mother's recent hip surgery. The past week had been emotionally draining as she helped them pack up 40 years of memories from their family home. She carried a simple black backpack and wore comfortable running shoes. To any observer, she looked like thousands of other travelers making their way through the airport that Tuesday morning. What they couldn't see was the sharp mind that had planned countless military operations, the hands that had flown fighter jets in combat zones, and the body that had endured some of the most demanding training the military offered. Flight 447 to San Diego was scheduled to depart at 10:30 a.m. Sarah arrived at her gate early, as was her habit. She found a seat facing the boarding area where she could observe the other passengers. This wasn't paranoia, it was simply how she had been trained to think. Situational awareness was as natural to her as breathing. The flight crew looked professional and experienced. Captain Martinez, a veteran pilot in his 50s, greeted passengers warmly as they boarded. Flight attendant Lisa Morrison, a blonde woman in her 30s, smiled genuinely at each person entering the aircraft. Her colleague, James Park, a young Asian man who looked to be in his mid-20s, seemed newer to the job, but eager to help passengers find their seats. Sarah had chosen seat 12A, a window seat about halfway back in the Boeing 737. She preferred to sit where she could see both the front and back of the aircraft while having a wall to her left side. Old habits from her military days made her uncomfortable when she couldn't control her environment completely. As passengers filed onto the plane, Sarah noted the usual mix of business travelers, families, and tourists. An elderly couple in their 70s sat across the aisle, discussing their upcoming visit with their grandchildren. Behind them, a young mother struggled to keep her toddler entertained while juggling a diaper bag and carry-on luggage. A businessman in an expensive suit typed furiously on his laptop, trying to finish some last-minute work. 3 men boarded near the end of the boarding process. They didn't sit together, which struck Sarah as slightly odd for a group traveling together. One was a tall, thin man with nervous eyes who took a seat near the front. The second was shorter and stockier, with calloused hands that suggested manual labor. He chose a middle seat about 6 rows ahead of Sarah. The third man was average height with a beard and intense dark eyes. He sat in the back of the plane, several rows behind Sarah. Something about their body language caught her attention. They moved with purpose but tried to appear casual. Their eyes darted around the cabin in a way that reminded her of soldiers on patrol in hostile territory. Sarah made mental notes of their positions while appearing to read a magazine she had purchased at a newsstand. The plane pushed back from the gate on schedule. Captain Martinez's voice came over the intercom with the standard safety announcements and flight information. The weather in San Diego was clear, and they expected a smooth flight of just over 2 hours. Sarah relaxed slightly as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. During takeoff, she observed the 3 men again. The one in front kept checking his watch every few minutes. The man in the back had his hand inside his jacket, as if touching something hidden there. The stocky man in the middle appeared to be the calmest of the 3, but his eyes never stopped moving around the cabin. About 30 minutes into the flight, when they had reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign was turned off, the situation changed dramatically. The tall, thin man near the front stood up quickly and moved toward the cockpit. At the same time, the stocky man rose from his seat and began walking toward the back of the plane. Sarah's training immediately kicked in. She recognized the coordinated movement as a classic tactical maneuver. Her body tensed, but she forced herself to remain still and continue observing. Years of experience had taught her that gathering information was crucial before taking action. The thin man knocked on the cockpit door and spoke to someone inside. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she saw Flight Attendant Morrison approach him with a concerned expression. Suddenly, the man grabbed Morrison's arm and pulled something from his jacket. Other passengers began to notice that something was wrong. The stocky man had reached the back of the plane and was speaking in urgent whispers to the bearded man. Together, they began moving forward through the cabin. Sarah noticed that both men now had their hands inside their jackets, and their entire demeanor had changed from casual travelers to something much more threatening. A woman near the front of the plane let out a small scream. Other passengers began to turn in their seats, trying to understand what was happening. The elderly man across the aisle from Sarah asked his wife what was going on, but she just shook her head with worried eyes. The thin man's voice suddenly rang out across the cabin, loud and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and stay in your seats. We are taking control of this aircraft." His words sent a chill through the cabin. Several passengers gasped, and someone behind Sarah whispered, "Oh my God." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but not from fear. This was the same feeling she had experienced before combat missions, a heightened awareness and mental clarity that came with years of training. Her mind automatically began assessing the situation and calculating possible responses. The stocky man was now standing in the middle of the cabin, facing the passengers. "Everyone keep quiet, and nobody gets hurt," he announced. "We have weapons, and we're not afraid to use them." He pulled his hand from his jacket to reveal what appeared to be a knife with a 4-inch blade. The bearded man had positioned himself at the back of the plane, effectively blocking the rear exit. Sarah realized they had planned this carefully. 3 men, positioned to control the entire aircraft with nowhere for passengers to run. Flight Attendant Morrison appeared to be in distress near the front of the plane. The thin man was forcing her to open the cockpit door. Through her peripheral vision, Sarah could see other passengers beginning to panic. Some were crying quietly, others were trying to call or text on their phones. The young mother with the toddler was now holding her child close to her chest, whispering reassurances while tears ran down her face. The businessman had closed his laptop and was staring straight ahead with wide, frightened eyes. The elderly couple was holding hands tightly, the woman praying quietly under her breath. Sarah forced herself to think tactically rather than emotionally. 3 attackers, armed with at least 1 blade and possibly other weapons. Approximately 120 passengers and crew members. The aircraft was at cruising altitude over Colorado, making any immediate landing unlikely. The hijackers' goal was unclear, but their coordination suggested serious planning and intent. The thin man had successfully entered the cockpit area. Sarah could hear raised voices from the front of the plane, though she couldn't make out specific words. The stocky man continued to patrol the middle section of the cabin, his knife visible as a clear threat to anyone who might consider resistance. What the hijackers didn't know was that they had chosen the wrong flight. Among the frightened passengers sat someone who had spent years training for exactly this type of situation. Sarah had completed multiple counterterrorism courses, hand-to-hand combat training, and had experience in close-quarters combat in some of the world's most dangerous places. But she also knew that acting too quickly could get innocent people killed. She needed to assess the full situation, understand the hijackers' capabilities and intentions, and find the right moment to act. The safety of over 100 innocent people was now in her hands, and she wouldn't waste that responsibility on a poorly planned response. The stocky man was moving closer to her row, his eyes scanning the passengers for any signs of resistance. Sarah kept her expression neutral and her body language submissive, playing the role of a frightened civilian. Inside, however, her mind was working like a tactical computer, calculating distances, angles, and possibilities. She noticed that the bearded man in the back kept touching his jacket pocket, suggesting he might have a weapon as well. The knife-wielding attacker in the middle was left-handed based on how he held his weapon, and he favored his right leg when he walked, possibly indicating an old injury that could be exploited. From the cockpit area, she could now hear Captain Martinez's voice, though it was strained and urgent. The hijackers were clearly making demands, but their specific goals remained unclear. Sarah knew that understanding their motivation would be crucial to stopping them effectively. The aircraft's engines hummed steadily, indicating they were still on course. If the hijackers had taken control of the navigation, they would likely change direction soon. Sarah realized she might have only minutes before the situation became even more complicated. The stocky man stopped next to the elderly couple across the aisle from Sarah. "You," he said, pointing at the old man with his knife. "Give me your phone." The man's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket and handed over his device. The hijacker smashed it on the floor and ground it under his heel. "Anyone else tries to use a phone, and my friends up front will hurt the pilots," the man announced loudly. "We control this plane now. Do what we say, and nobody dies." His voice carried a slight accent that Sarah couldn't immediately place, but his English was fluent and his manner suggested military or paramilitary training. Sarah's options were becoming clearer. She could attempt to neutralize the middle attacker, but that would alert the other two and potentially put the pilots and other passengers at immediate risk. She could try to communicate with other passengers to coordinate a group response, but that would require time and carry significant risk of discovery. The young flight attendant, James Park, appeared from the galley area looking pale and shaken. The bearded hijacker immediately moved toward him, grabbing his arm and speaking in harsh whispers. Park nodded quickly and began moving toward the front of the plane, clearly under duress. Sarah realized the hijackers were likely planning to use the crew members as leverage or to help control the other passengers. This was a common tactic in aircraft hijackings, and it meant the situation was becoming more dangerous for everyone on board. The woman with the toddler was now crying openly, trying to muffle her sobs so as not to attract attention. Her child, sensing the distress, began to whimper as well. The stocky hijacker looked in their direction with irritation, and Sarah felt her jaw clench. These men were threatening innocent children, and that made her anger burn cold and focused. She had spent years protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. In Iraq and Afghanistan, she had flown missions to extract wounded soldiers from combat zones. She had led teams that rescued hostages from terrorist compounds. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to act, but her training demanded patience and precision. The thin man emerged from the cockpit area, his face grim with satisfaction. He spoke to the stocky man in a language Sarah didn't recognize, though the tone suggested they were pleased with their progress. The bearded man had positioned Flight Attendant Park near the rear galley, where he could keep an eye on both the passenger cabin and the back exit. Sarah noticed that none of the hijackers appeared to have guns, relying instead on knives and the threat of violence. This was likely intentional. Guns would have been much harder to get past airport security, and knives could be just as effective for controlling passengers in the confined space of an aircraft. The plane's trajectory remained steady, but Sarah suspected that when the hijacker with the knife moved closer to Sarah's section of the plane, his eyes scanning each passenger with cold calculation. She kept her breathing steady and her face neutral, years of undercover training helping her maintain the appearance of a frightened civilian. Every muscle in her body was coiled and ready, but she forced herself to remain still. Captain Martinez's voice came over the intercom, strained but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a security situation. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from the cabin crew." Sarah could hear the coded distress in his words. He was trying to communicate the danger without escalating the situation. The thin hijacker returned from the cockpit and spoke urgently to his partners in their unknown language. Sarah's ear was trained enough to recognize it wasn't Arabic, Russian, or any of the European languages she knew from her military service. The rhythm and sounds suggested something from Southeast Asia or possibly Eastern Europe. Whatever they were discussing, it was clearly important. The bearded man left his position at the back of the plane and moved toward the front, leaving Flight Attendant Park unguarded near the rear galley. This was the first tactical mistake Sarah had observed, and she filed it away for future use. The stocky hijacker stopped next to a businessman about 4 rows ahead of Sarah and demanded his briefcase. The man complied quickly, his hands shaking as he handed over the expensive leather case. The hijacker dumped its contents into the aisle: papers, a laptop, some expensive pens, and what appeared to be several $1,000s in cash. "Where you going with all this money?" the hijacker asked with a sneer. The businessman mumbled something about a real estate deal, but the hijacker had already lost interest. He pocketed the cash and kicked the scattered papers under the seats. Sarah noticed that the other passengers were watching this interaction with growing terror. An elderly businessman 2 rows behind her was discreetly trying to hide his Rolex watch, and a young woman near the window was clutching her purse tightly against her chest. The hijackers were clearly planning to rob the passengers as well as control the aircraft. The plane's engines changed pitch slightly, and Sarah felt the aircraft begin a gradual turn to the left. They were changing course, which meant the hijackers had successfully taken control of navigation. She estimated they had been airborne for about 45 minutes, which put them somewhere over the Rocky Mountains. The thin hijacker returned to the main cabin and announced in a louder voice, "We are flying to our destination. Anyone who causes problems will be hurt. Anyone who tries to be hero will be killed." His grammar wasn't perfect, but his meaning was crystal clear. A middle-aged woman near the front of the plane began sobbing loudly, and her husband tried to comfort her while shooting terrified glances at the nearest hijacker. The man with the knife moved toward them menacingly, and Sarah tensed, ready to act if he threatened to hurt the woman. "Shut up," the stocky hijacker growled at the crying woman. "No noise, or I hurt your husband." The woman immediately stifled her sobs, pressing her face against her husband's shoulder. The threat of violence against a loved one was often more effective than personal threats, and these men clearly understood human psychology. Sarah's military training had included extensive instruction in terrorist tactics and hostage psychology. She recognized that the hijackers were using classic control techniques, establishing dominance through fear, isolating potential leaders, and creating a sense of hopelessness among the victims. What they didn't know was that their primary threat wasn't identifying herself. The young mother with the toddler was now facing a new crisis. Her child had become increasingly upset and was beginning to cry loudly. The bearded hijacker, who had returned to a position near the middle of the cabin, was looking in their direction with obvious irritation. Sarah made a quick decision. She turned in her seat and spoke quietly to the mother. "Hey, what's your little one's name?" she asked with a gentle smile, keeping her voice calm and reassuring. The woman looked up with tear-filled eyes. "Emma. Her name is Emma. She's scared, and I don't know how to." Her voice trailed off as she glanced nervously at the nearest hijacker. "Emma's beautiful," Sarah said, still speaking softly. "I bet she likes games. Maybe we could play peek-boo." She made a silly face at the toddler, who momentarily stopped crying and looked at this new person with curious eyes. The stocky hijacker noticed the interaction and moved toward Sarah. "No talking," he said firmly, pointing his knife in her direction. "Stay quiet." Sarah nodded submissively and turned back around, but she had accomplished her goal. The little girl was no longer crying, and Sarah had established herself as someone willing to help others. This might be useful later if she needed other passengers to trust her quickly. More importantly, she had gotten a closer look at the hijacker's weapon and stance. The knife was a standard folding blade, about 4 inches long with a serrated edge. He held it competently, but not with the precision of someone with extensive knife-fighting training. His stance suggested street fighting experience rather than military combat training. The aircraft continued its turn, and Sarah estimated they were now heading southeast instead of southwest towards San Diego. If the hijackers were planning to fly to Mexico or Central America, it would explain the course change. However, the fuel capacity of a Boeing 737 would limit their range, especially if they hadn't planned for the extra distance. Captain Martinez's voice came over the intercom again. "Air traffic control is aware of our situation. We are complying with all requests to ensure passenger safety." Again, Sarah heard the professional code words that indicated he was trying to communicate with authorities on the ground while not provoking the hijackers. The thin hijacker apparently understood the implications of the captain's announcement. He disappeared into the cockpit area again, and Sarah could hear raised voices and what sounded like a physical altercation. Several passengers looked around nervously, clearly wondering if the situation was about to get worse. Flight attendant Morrison appeared from the front galley area, her uniform disheveled and her face pale. She was carrying a large black bag that she hadn't had before. The bearded hijacker took the bag from her and began going through its contents, pulling out what appeared to be additional restraints and possibly more weapons. Sarah realized the hijackers had come much better prepared than she had initially thought. This wasn't an improvised takeover. It was a carefully planned operation with backup equipment and multiple contingency plans that made them more dangerous, but also meant they might be more predictable in their actions. The stocky hijacker was now working his way through the passenger cabin systematically, demanding wallets, jewelry, and phones from each person. Sarah watched his pattern and realized he would reach her row in about 2 minutes. She needed to decide how to handle the interaction without revealing her training or capabilities. An older gentleman about 3 rows ahead tried to argue when the hijacker demanded his wedding ring. "Please, this was my father's ring. It has sentimental value, but it's not worth much money," he pleaded. The hijacker's response was swift and brutal. He grabbed the man's hand and bent his fingers back until the man cried out in pain. "Give me ring or I break fingers," he snarled. The man quickly removed the ring with tears in his eyes, and his wife looked on in horror. This display of casual violence had its intended effect on the other passengers. When the hijacker continued down the aisle, people gave up their valuables immediately without any resistance. Sarah noted that the man enjoyed inflicting pain and used it as a control mechanism. This personality trait could potentially be exploited if she needed to distract or manipulate him. The aircraft shuddered slightly as it encountered some turbulence, and Sarah felt the plane descend a few hundred feet before stabilizing again. They were definitely flying a different route than the planned course to San Diego, probably trying to avoid major air traffic control centers or military installations. The young flight attendant Park had been forced to collect passenger phones in a large bag, moving through the cabin under the watchful eye of the bearded hijacker. Sarah could see the terror in his eyes, but also noted that he was trying to comfort passengers with small gestures, a reassuring nod here, a gentle touch on the shoulder there. His courage under pressure impressed her. When Park reached Sarah's row, she handed over her basic smartphone without resistance. She had deliberately chosen to carry an older, inexpensive phone for this trip, keeping her military-issued secure device at home. The hijacker wouldn't find anything useful on the civilian phone. "Thank you," Park whispered as he took her phone, and Sarah saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps he sensed that she was different from the other passengers, or maybe he was just grateful for her calm demeanor. Either way, she filed away the moment as potentially useful. The stocky hijacker finally reached Sarah's row. He looked her up and down with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. "Wallet, jewelry, everything," he demanded, holding his knife where she could clearly see the blade. Sarah reached into her back pocket and pulled out a simple leather wallet containing about $60 in cash, a civilian driver's license, and a couple of credit cards. She had left all her military identification and significant cash at home, as was her practice when traveling in civilian clothes. "That's all?" the hijacker asked suspiciously, examining the modest contents of her wallet. "I'm just a teacher," Sarah said quietly, using the cover story she had developed years ago. "Flying home from visiting my parents. I don't have much money." Her tone was submissive and slightly embarrassed, exactly what the hijacker would expect from someone who felt ashamed of her financial situation. The man grunted and pocketed her cash and credit cards, but handed the wallet back. He moved on to the elderly couple across the aisle, who surrendered their valuables without resistance. Sarah noticed that he kept her driver's license, probably as standard practice to prevent passengers from easily identifying themselves to authorities later. The bearded hijacker had positioned himself where he could observe both the front and back sections of the passenger cabin. Sarah noted that he was the most alert and disciplined of the three, constantly scanning for threats and maintaining good situational awareness. If she had to prioritize targets, he would be the most dangerous. From the cockpit area, she could hear the sound of radio communications. The hijackers were apparently making contact with someone on the ground, though she couldn't make out the specific words. This suggested they were part of a larger organization rather than acting independently. The plane began another course change, this time turning more sharply to the right. Sarah felt the aircraft descend again, and she realized they might be preparing to land somewhere. If they were planning to refuel or transfer to another aircraft, it would provide opportunities for rescue that didn't exist while airborne. A businessman near the front of the plane suddenly stood up and declared, "This is ridiculous. You can't just steal from innocent people and threaten to hurt us. I'm calling the authorities." He pulled out a phone that he had apparently hidden from the earlier collection. The response was immediate and violent. The thin hijacker appeared from the cockpit area and struck the man across the face with something metallic, possibly a gun or metal bar. The businessman fell back into his seat, blood streaming from his nose, while other passengers gasped in shock. "Next person who tries to be hero gets worse," the thin hijacker announced loudly. He held up what Sarah now saw was indeed a small pistol, apparently smuggled aboard in pieces and reassembled after takeoff. "We have guns and we will use them." The revelation that the hijackers had firearms changed the tactical situation significantly. Sarah had been planning her response based on the assumption that they only had knives, but guns meant any physical confrontation would be much more dangerous for innocent passengers. The injured businessman was now slouched in his seat, semi-conscious and bleeding. His seatmate, a young woman who appeared to be his daughter, was crying and trying to stop the bleeding with tissues from her purse. The sight of blood and the man's obvious pain had a profound psychological effect on the other passengers. Sarah felt her anger growing cold and focused. These men were escalating their violence, and it was only a matter of time before someone was seriously hurt or killed. Her window for action was narrowing, and she needed to start positioning herself for whatever opportunity might arise. The stocky hijacker had finished robbing the passengers and was now standing near the middle of the cabin, counting money and examining the jewelry and watches he had collected. Sarah estimated they had stolen several $1,000s in cash and valuables, but that seemed almost secondary to their main objective. Flight attendant Morrison was being forced to demonstrate how to open the aircraft's emergency exits, which suggested the hijackers were planning for a ground operation after landing. The bearded hijacker was taking notes and asking specific technical questions, indicating a level of planning and intelligence that made them even more dangerous. The toddler Emma had begun crying again, probably sensing the increased tension in the cabin after the businessman was attacked. Her mother was trying desperately to comfort her while shooting terrified glances at the nearest hijacker. Sarah could see that the young woman was on the verge of a complete breakdown. The aircraft's engines changed pitch again, and Sarah felt them descend. In the aircraft's descent became more pronounced, and Sarah could see they were approaching what appeared to be a small airfield carved into a valley between mountains. This wasn't a commercial airport. The runway was too short, and there were no terminal buildings visible. The hijackers had planned to land at a remote location where they could operate without interference. The thin hijacker returned to the passenger cabin and made an announcement. "We are landing soon. Everyone will remain seated until we tell you to move. Anyone who tries to run or fight will be shot." He waved his pistol to emphasize his words, and several passengers whimpered in fear. Sarah's mind raced through the tactical implications. Once they were on the ground, the hijackers would likely have support waiting for them. The passengers would be moved from the aircraft, probably to vehicles or buildings where they could be held more securely. This would be her last opportunity to act while the hijackers were isolated and outnumbered. The bearded hijacker moved toward the back of the plane and began speaking urgently into a handheld radio. Sarah caught fragments of his conversation, something about package secure and on schedule. She realized they were coordinating with ground personnel, which meant there would be additional threats waiting once they landed. Captain Martinez's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and remain calm." His voice was steady, but Sarah detected the underlying tension of a man who knew his passengers were in mortal danger. The stocky hijacker with the knife had positioned himself near the middle of the cabin where he could observe most of the passengers. Sarah noted that his attention was focused primarily on the adult male passengers, identifying them as the most likely sources of resistance. This gender bias might work to her advantage. The aircraft touched down with a hard bump, and Sarah felt the engine's reverse thrust as Captain Martinez brought the plane to a rapid stop. Through her window, She could see several vehicles approaching the aircraft, two large trucks, and what appeared to be a fuel tanker. The hijackers' ground support was already in position. As the plane rolled to a stop, the thin hijacker emerged from the cockpit and spoke rapidly to his companions. Sarah didn't understand the words, but their body language suggested urgency and excitement. They had successfully completed the first phase of their operation and were preparing for whatever came next. The bearded hijacker moved to the front of the cabin and began addressing the passengers. Everyone will leave the plane in order. Families with small children first, then women, then men. No talking, no running, no trying to hide. Our friends outside will shoot anyone who doesn't follow instructions exactly. Sarah realized this was likely her last chance to act. Once the passengers were off the aircraft and dispersed among multiple captors, mounting any kind of rescue would become nearly impossible. She had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before the evacuation began. The stocky hijacker was still standing near her section of the cabin, his knife ready and his eyes constantly moving. The bearded hijacker had moved toward the aircraft door to coordinate with the ground team. The thin hijacker was presumably still in the cockpit area with the pilots. Sarah began her mental countdown. She needed to neutralize the knife-wielding attacker first, since he was closest and represented the immediate threat to passengers in her area. Then, she would have to deal with the bearded hijacker before he could alert the others or harm the passengers near the exit. The biggest unknown was the location and alertness of the thin hijacker with the gun. The young mother with toddler Emma was gathering her belongings, preparing to be among the first passengers to leave the aircraft. Sarah caught the woman's eye and gave her a subtle nod, hoping to convey reassurance without attracting the hijacker's attention. The woman seemed to understand and nodded back slightly. Flight attendant Morrison appeared from the front galley and began preparing the main cabin door for opening. Sarah could hear voices outside the aircraft and the sound of vehicle engines. The ground team was ready to receive the passengers, which meant time was running out. The stocky hijacker moved closer to Sarah's row, apparently planning to ensure orderly evacuation from her section of the cabin. This brought him within arm's reach, exactly where Sarah needed him to be. She forced her breathing to remain calm, while every muscle in her body prepared for action. The aircraft door opened with a mechanical whine, and Sarah could hear the bearded hijacker speaking to someone outside. Cold mountain air rushed into the cabin, carrying the sounds of diesel engines, and shouted instructions in the same unknown language the hijackers had been using. Families with children, stand up and move to the front, the bearded hijacker commanded. The young mother with Emma began to rise from her seat, along with an elderly couple traveling with their teenage granddaughter. Their movement created the distraction Sarah had been waiting for. Sarah's training took over completely. 15 years of combat experience compressed into a few seconds of precisely calculated violence. She rose from her seat as if following the evacuation order, but instead of moving toward the aisle, she pivoted toward the stocky hijacker. Her first strike was a palm thrust to his solar plexus, delivered with enough force to temporarily paralyze his diaphragm and prevent him from calling out. As he doubled over, gasping for breath, she grabbed his knife hand and twisted his wrist in a direction it wasn't designed to go. The knife clattered to the floor as he tried unsuccessfully to scream. The entire attack took less than 3 seconds and was completed before any of the other passengers fully understood what was happening. Sarah immediately grabbed the fallen knife and pressed it against the hijacker's throat while positioning his body between herself and the front of the aircraft. "Everyone stay down," she commanded in a voice that carried absolute authority. The military training that had been hidden beneath her civilian appearance was now fully visible. "I'm going to get us out of this, but I need you to do exactly what I say." The bearded hijacker at the front of the plane had heard the commotion and was turning around to investigate. Sarah knew she had perhaps 5 seconds before he identified the threat and responded. The knife at her captive's throat ensured his silence, but she needed to neutralize the second hijacker before he could alert the ground team or the man with the gun. "You," she said quietly to the stocky hijacker, "are going to walk toward the front of the plane with me. If you make any sound or any sudden movement, I will kill you. Do you understand?" The man nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror as he realized the harmless-looking woman was actually a trained killer. Sarah began moving forward, using the hijacker's body as a shield while keeping the knife positioned where she could deliver a fatal wound instantly. The other passengers pressed themselves back into their seats, some staring in amazement at the sudden transformation of the quiet woman who had been sitting among them. The bearded hijacker was now looking directly at them, his hand reaching for something inside his jacket. Sarah had to act before he could draw a weapon or raise an alarm. She shoved her captive forward with enough force to send him stumbling into the bearded man, then followed immediately behind. The collision sent both hijackers crashing into the bulkhead near the aircraft door. Sarah was on them instantly, using techniques she had learned in close-quarters combat training. A precise strike to the bearded hijacker's wrist caused him to drop the pistol he had been trying to draw, and a follow-up blow to his temple rendered him unconscious. The stocky hijacker was trying to get back to his feet, but Sarah kicked his legs out from under him and applied a chokehold that would leave him unconscious in seconds. Both men collapsed to the floor, neutralized without any shots being fired or alarms being raised. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 15 seconds, and the thin hijacker in the cockpit was apparently unaware that his partners had been defeated. Sarah could hear him talking to someone on a radio, probably coordinating with the ground team outside. She quickly searched the unconscious hijackers and found 2 additional knives, a second pistol, and several sets of plastic restraints. The bearded hijacker also carried a handheld radio and what appeared to be a detonator device, though she couldn't see any obvious explosives. This suggested the hijackers had even more capabilities than she had realized. "Listen carefully," Sarah announced to the passengers, her voice calm but urgent. "I'm a Navy SEAL pilot. These men are now neutralized, but we still have 1 hijacker in the cockpit and an unknown number of hostiles outside the aircraft. I need everyone to remain calm and follow my instructions exactly." The passengers stared at her in stunned silence. The transformation from frightened civilian to military operator was so complete and sudden that some of them seemed unable to process what they had witnessed. The elderly man across the aisle was the first to speak. "My God, young lady, are you really military?" he asked in a whisper. "Yes, sir, I am. And right now, I need your help to get everyone home safely." Sarah's response was crisp and professional. She had shifted completely into mission mode, and every decision would now be based on tactical necessity rather than civilian concerns. Sarah moved quickly to the cockpit door, which was still closed and locked. She could hear the thin hijacker inside talking urgently on his radio, apparently trying to coordinate the passenger evacuation with the ground team. She realized he didn't yet know that his partners were unconscious. She knocked on the cockpit door in the same pattern the hijacker had used earlier, hoping to trick him into opening it voluntarily. After a moment, she heard movement inside and the sound of the lock being disengaged. The door opened slightly, and Sarah could see part of the hijacker's face as he peered out. "What's taking so long with the passengers?" he asked in English, apparently assuming he was talking to one of his partners. Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. She drove her shoulder into the partially opened door, sending the hijacker stumbling backward into the cockpit. Before he could recover his balance or reach for his weapon, she was on top of him with the knife she had taken from the stocky hijacker. The fight in the confined space of the cockpit was brief but intense. The hijacker was armed with a pistol, but Sarah's close proximity training gave her a significant advantage in the cramped environment. A series of precise strikes to nerve points and pressure points disabled his gun hand and left him gasping in pain on the cockpit floor. Captain Martinez and his co-pilot, who had been forced to sit quietly during the hijacking, looked at Sarah with amazement and relief. "Captain, I'm Commander Sarah Chun, United States Navy. Are you and your crew injured?" she asked quickly. "We're okay," Martinez replied, his voice shaky but determined. "But there are armed men outside the aircraft, and they're expecting us to start evacuating passengers. What do we do?" Sarah looked out the cockpit windows and counted at least 6 armed men positioned around the aircraft. They were dressed in military-style clothing and carried assault rifles. 2 vehicles were parked nearby, a large truck that could transport passengers, and a smaller SUV that probably belonged to the leadership. The fuel tanker was positioned next to the aircraft's wing, suggesting the hijackers had planned to refuel for another flight to a final destination. This remote airfield was just a stopping point in a larger operation, which explained why they needed to control the passengers rather than simply robbing them. "How much fuel do we have remaining?" Sarah asked the pilots. "About 40 minutes at normal cruise, maybe an hour if we're conservative," the co-pilot replied. "Enough to reach several major airports if we can get airborne." Sarah quickly examined the hijackers' radio equipment and found that one of the devices was set to what appeared to be the ground team's frequency. She could hear voices speaking in the same unknown language, growing increasingly agitated. The ground team was definitely becoming suspicious about the delay. "Captain Martinez, I need you to prepare for immediate takeoff," Sarah said urgently. "Can you get us airborne quickly? The engines are still running, but we need to taxi to the other end of the runway for a proper takeoff run," Martinez replied. "These people aren't going to just let us leave." Sarah studied the tactical situation through the cockpit windows. The armed men were positioned around the aircraft in a loose perimeter, but they weren't in defensive positions. They were clearly expecting a routine prisoner transfer, not a firefight. Their relaxed posture might give her the element of surprise she needed. One of the hijackers' radios crackled to life with an urgent voice speaking rapidly in their native language. Sarah didn't understand the words, but the tone suggested someone was demanding an immediate response. She had to act before they decided to investigate the aircraft directly. "I'm going to buy you time to get us out of here," Sarah told the pilots. "When I give you the signal, start taxiing immediately toward the takeoff position. Don't stop for anything, and don't wait for me." "What are you planning to do?" Captain Martinez asked with concern in his voice. "I'm going to make sure those men can't follow us or hurt any passengers," Sarah replied grimly. She gathered the hijackers' weapons and equipment, including what appeared to be several smoke grenades and the mysterious detonator device she had found earlier. Sarah quickly briefed the senior flight attendant, Lisa Morrison, on what was about to happen. "Keep the passengers calm and seated. Tell them we're about to take off and that everything is under control. If you hear gunfire or explosions, get everyone on the floor until we're airborne." She then moved to the aircraft's main door, which was still open from the hijackers' preparations for evacuation. Outside, she could see two armed men standing about 20 feet away, their attention focused on the aircraft door as they waited for passengers to emerge. The fuel tanker was positioned next to the aircraft's wing, and Sarah realized it presented both an opportunity and a danger. If she could disable or damage it, the resulting explosion or fire would create chaos and prevent the ground team from pursuing them. However, the explosion would also be dangerously close to the aircraft and passengers. Sarah made her decision. She activated one of the smoke grenades and tossed it out the aircraft door, immediately creating a thick gray cloud that obscured the area around the plane. The two guards near the door began shouting in alarm and confusion, alerting the rest of their team that something was wrong. Using the smoke as cover, Sarah dropped from the aircraft door and moved quickly toward the fuel tanker. Her military training in explosive ordnance disposal had taught her how to identify vulnerable points in fuel storage systems, and she spotted the tanker's main valve assembly near the rear of the vehicle. The guards were now moving toward the aircraft, their assault rifles ready, but their vision severely limited by the smoke. Sarah could hear them shouting to each other, trying to coordinate their response to this unexpected development. Their confusion was exactly what she had hoped for. She reached the fuel tanker undetected and quickly examined its construction. The vehicle was an older model with standard safety systems that could be manually overridden. Sarah used the knife she had taken from the hijacker to damage several critical connections, causing fuel to begin spilling onto the ground around the tanker. The sound of the leaking fuel was masked by the continuing shouts and confusion from the armed men, who were now firing randomly into the smoke cloud around the aircraft. Sarah could hear Captain Martinez starting the engines at higher power, preparing to taxi away from the dangerous situation. Sarah's next move was the most dangerous part of her plan. She needed to create enough chaos and destruction to prevent the ground team from pursuing the aircraft, but she also needed to get back aboard before Captain Martinez was forced to leave without her. The timing would have to be perfect. She pulled the pin from a second smoke grenade and tossed it near the fuel spill, creating another dense cloud that would help mask her movements. Then, she retrieved what appeared to be an incendiary device from the hijackers' equipment, a small cylinder with a timer mechanism that she set for 15 seconds. The device was placed near the largest concentration of spilled fuel, positioned to create maximum damage to the tanker and surrounding vehicles. Sarah then began moving back toward the aircraft, staying low and using the smoke clouds to avoid detection by the increasingly agitated guards. One of the armed men emerged from the smoke directly in front of her, his rifle raised and his finger on the trigger. Sarah's reaction was instinctive and lethal, a precise strike to his throat followed by a disarming move that left him unconscious on the ground with his weapon in her hands. The assault rifle gave her significantly more firepower, but also made her more dangerous to the innocent passengers if something went wrong. Sarah made a quick tactical decision to disable the weapon's firing mechanism rather than carry a loaded gun back onto the aircraft, keeping the rifle only as a deterrent. The incendiary device exploded with a bright flash and immediate flame, igniting the spilled fuel and creating exactly the chaos Sarah had planned. The fuel tanker erupted in a massive fireball that sent the remaining guards diving for cover behind their vehicles. Secondary explosions from the tanker's remaining fuel created additional confusion and panic. Captain Martinez had begun taxiing the aircraft away from the burning tanker as soon as he heard the initial explosion. Sarah ran alongside the slowly moving plane, staying close to the fuselage to avoid the intense heat from the fire behind her. The main cabin door was still open, and she could see Flight Attendant Morrison waiting to help her back aboard. Sarah tossed the disabled rifle through the door and pulled herself up into the aircraft as it continued moving toward the far end of the runway. Behind them, the fuel tanker continued to burn furiously while the surviving members of the ground team tried to reorganize themselves and assess their casualties. "Is everyone okay?" Sarah asked Morrison as she secured the cabin door behind them. "All passengers are accounted for and secured," Morrison replied professionally. "2 people have minor injuries from when the guards started shooting, but nothing serious." Sarah quickly checked on the 3 unconscious hijackers, confirming they were still securely restrained and no longer posed a threat. The detonator device she had found earlier appeared to be for a small explosive charge that was probably intended to threaten the aircraft if things went wrong, but she had already disabled its battery connections. The aircraft reached the end of the runway, and Captain Martinez began his takeoff roll immediately, not waiting for any clearance from the hijackers' makeshift control tower. The engines roared to full power as they accelerated down the rough runway, leaving the burning airfield behind them. Through her window, Sarah could see that the surviving members of the ground team were attempting to pursue them in their remaining vehicle, but the aircraft lifted off before they could reach firing range. The fuel tanker continued to burn in the distance, sending a thick column of black smoke into the mountain air. As they climbed away from the remote airfield, Captain Martinez got on the radio to contact legitimate air traffic control and report their situation. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 447. We have escaped from a hijacking situation and need immediate assistance and vector to nearest secure airport." The response from air traffic control was immediate and professional. "Flight 447, we have been tracking your situation. Military escort is being scrambled to your position. Please proceed direct to Peterson Air Force Base for emergency landing. Medical and security personnel are standing by." Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly as she realized they had successfully escaped from immediate danger. The passengers were safe, the hijackers were neutralized, and they were now under the protection of the United States Air Force. However, she knew that debriefing and investigation would take hours or even days. The elderly gentleman across the aisle from her spoke up quietly. "Young lady, I don't know how to thank you. You saved all of our lives." His wife was nodding vigorously, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Just doing my job, sir," Sarah replied modestly. "But we're not completely safe yet. Those men were part of a larger organization, and we need to make sure the authorities understand what we're dealing with." Sarah began organizing the evidence she had collected from the hijackers, their weapons, communications equipment, maps, and identification documents. This information would be crucial for identifying and stopping the rest of their organization before they could attempt another attack. The young mother with toddler Emma approached Sarah cautiously. "I want to thank you too," she said softly. "When I saw how calm you were with Emma earlier, I thought you might be someone special. I never imagined you were military." "Your daughter is beautiful," Sarah replied with a genuine smile. "I'm glad I could keep her safe." The normal, human interaction felt strange after the intense combat situation, but it reminded Sarah why she had chosen to serve her country in the first place. Flight attendant Morrison was moving through the cabin, checking on passengers and providing first aid to those who had minor injuries from the gunfire. Her professional calm helped reassure the passengers that the crisis was truly over and they were returning to safety. The aircraft's radio crackled with communications from the military escort that was being vectored to their position. "Flight 447, this is Viper 1. We have visual contact and are establishing protective formation. You are cleared direct to Peterson with priority handling." Through her window, Sarah could see two F-16 fighter jets taking position on either side of their aircraft. The sight of the military escort provided visible reassurance to the passengers, many of whom were seeing combat aircraft for the first time. The United States Air Force was ensuring that no further threats could reach them. Captain Martinez made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Thanks to the heroic actions of one of our passengers, we have successfully escaped from our hijackers and are now under military escort. We will be landing at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs in approximately 30 minutes, where medical personnel and FBI agents will be waiting to assist you." The businesswoman who had been traveling with the injured businessman was crying with relief as she held his hand. His injuries from the hijackers' attack were painful but not life-threatening, and he was conscious and alert. The sight of his blood had been one of the most traumatic aspects of the hijacking for many passengers. Sarah realized that the psychological effects of this experience would last far longer than the physical ones. Many of these people would need counseling and support to deal with the trauma of being held hostage by armed terrorists. Some might never feel safe flying again. The three hijackers were beginning to regain consciousness, but their restraints were secure and they no longer posed any physical threat. Sarah kept watch on them while reviewing their equipment and documents, looking for clues about their organization and possible future targets. One of the maps showed several other small airfields in remote locations, suggesting this had been part of a larger network of terrorist operations. The communications equipment was sophisticated and expensive, indicating significant funding and technical support. These men weren't independent criminals. They were part of something much bigger and more dangerous. As they approached Peterson Air Force Base, Sarah could see the extensive security preparations that had been made for their arrival. Multiple emergency vehicles, FBI command units, and military security teams were positioned around the runway. The authorities were taking no chances with either the passengers' safety or the security of the evidence. The aircraft touched down smoothly at Peterson, and Captain Martinez taxied directly to a secure area of the base where armed security personnel were waiting. Sarah gathered her evidence and prepared for what would certainly be an extensive debriefing process with multiple federal agencies. The aircraft door opened to reveal a coordinated response that impressed even Sarah's military-trained eyes. FBI agents, Air Force security personnel, and medical teams moved with practiced efficiency to secure the aircraft and begin processing the passengers. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, a senior counterterrorism investigator, boarded the plane and immediately approached Sarah. "Commander Chun, I'm Agent Torres, FBI. We need to debrief you immediately about what happened up there," she said, her tone professional but respectful. "Your actions today likely prevented a major terrorist attack, but we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Sarah handed over the weapons and equipment she had collected from the hijackers. "The three men are secured in the forward section. They're part of a larger organization. This was too well planned and equipped to be an independent operation. Their communications gear and maps suggest multiple locations and ongoing operations." The hijackers were carefully removed from the aircraft by a specialized team wearing protective equipment. Even unconscious and restrained, they were treated as extremely dangerous individuals. Sarah noted that the FBI was taking every precaution to ensure they couldn't escape or communicate with outside accomplices. The passengers were escorted off the aircraft in small groups, with each person being briefly questioned and then taken to a secure area for more detailed interviews. Medical personnel checked everyone for injuries, both physical and psychological. Several passengers specifically asked about Sarah, wanting to thank her personally for saving their lives. The young mother carrying Emma stopped next to Sarah as she was escorted off the plane. "I still can't believe what you did," she said softly. "You're a real hero." Sarah simply smiled and told her to take care of her beautiful daughter. Some definitions of heroism, she reflected, were worth living up to. Agent Torres led Sarah to a secure conference room in the base's intelligence facility, where representatives from multiple federal agencies were waiting. The group included FBI counterterrorism specialists, military intelligence officers, and someone Sarah recognized as being from the Defense Intelligence Agency. "Commander, we've been tracking this terrorist cell for several months," Torres began. "They call themselves the Mountain Liberation Front, and they've been planning attacks on civilian aircraft as part of a larger destabilization campaign. Your capture of these 3 men and their equipment is the biggest breakthrough we've had in the case." Sarah provided a detailed account of everything she had observed during the hijacking, from the hijackers' coordination and equipment to their communications and apparent objectives. Her military training and intelligence gathering made her observations particularly valuable to the investigators. "The airfield where they planned to take us wasn't just a refueling stop," Sarah explained. "Based on their equipment and the ground team that was waiting, I believe they intended to transfer the passengers to other locations or use the aircraft for a follow-up attack. The fuel tanker and the sophisticated communications gear suggest they had significant logistical support." The intelligence officers showed Sarah satellite photos of the remote airfield, now showing the burned wreckage of the fuel tanker and several damaged vehicles. Military reconnaissance had identified at least 3 bodies among the terrorist ground team, with several others believed to have escaped into the surrounding mountains. The man who appeared to be their leader carried maps showing at least 6 other similar airfields in remote areas, Sarah continued. "If this was part of a coordinated campaign, there could be other hijacking teams preparing to strike civilian aircraft. The level of planning and resources suggests state sponsorship or support from a major criminal organization." Agent Torres nodded grimly. "We're coordinating with international partners to track down their funding sources and identify other cells. The communications equipment you recovered is providing valuable intelligence about their networks and planned operations." The debriefing continued for several hours as Sarah provided every detail she could remember about the hijackers' appearance, behavior, equipment, and communications. Her military experience allowed her to provide technical assessments that civilian witnesses couldn't offer, including detailed descriptions of weapons, tactics, and operational procedures. During a brief break, Sarah was able to call her parents and let them know she was safe. The hijacking had already become national news, and her father had recognized her name in news reports about a military passenger who had stopped the attack. His pride in her accomplishments was evident even over the phone. "I knew my daughter was special," her father told her, his voice thick with emotion. "But I never imagined she'd be saving entire plane loads of innocent people. Your mother and I are so proud of you." Sarah also received calls from her military commanders, who were already coordinating with the FBI investigation and ensuring that her actions would be properly recognized. Her commanding officer informed her that she would likely receive a significant commendation for her courage and effectiveness under extreme circumstances. The 3 hijackers had been transported to a secure federal facility for interrogation, but initial results were not encouraging. They appeared to be disciplined operatives who had been trained to resist questioning, providing only basic identification information and no details about their organization or plans. However, the physical evidence Sarah had captured was proving extremely valuable. The communications equipment contained encrypted data that intelligence analysts were working to decode, and the maps and documents provided leads to other suspected terrorist locations. Most importantly, the disruption of their operation would force the terrorist organization to change their plans and expose themselves to further detection. The investigation revealed that the Mountain Liberation Front had been planning a series of coordinated attacks on civilian aircraft, intending to crash hijacked planes into major population centers in a repeat of the September 11th attacks. Sarah's intervention had not only saved the passengers on Flight 447, but had also disrupted a much larger plot that could have killed thousands of innocent people. Captain Martinez and his crew were also extensively debriefed about their experience, providing valuable information about the hijackers' technical knowledge and capabilities. The fact that they had successfully taken control of the aircraft's navigation systems suggested sophisticated training and inside knowledge of commercial aviation procedures. Flight attendants Morrison and Park were praised for their professionalism and courage during the crisis, particularly for their efforts to keep passengers calm and assist Sarah when she moved to neutralize the hijackers. Their actions demonstrated the importance of well-trained cabin crew in aviation security situations. The passengers from Flight 447 were eventually released after completing their interviews, but many chose to stay in contact with each other and with Sarah. The shared experience of surviving a terrorist attack had created bonds that would last for years, and several passengers credited Sarah not just with saving their lives, but with restoring their faith in human courage and capability. The elderly gentleman who had sat across the aisle from Sarah became one of her strongest advocates, writing letters to newspapers and government officials praising her actions and calling for greater recognition of military personnel who serve with such distinction. His wife started a support fund for the families of military service members, inspired by Sarah's example. The businessman who had been injured by the hijackers made a complete recovery and later established a scholarship program for children of military families, specifically mentioning Sarah's heroism as his inspiration. He often spoke about how her calm presence during the crisis had helped him maintain hope even when he was bleeding and in pain. 3 months after the hijacking, Sarah received the Navy Cross, one of the military's highest decorations for valor, in a ceremony attended by her family, the Flight 447 passengers, and senior government officials. The citation praised her extraordinary heroism and exceptional courage in single-handedly defeating a terrorist hijacking and saving the lives of 127 innocent civilians. The investigation into the Mountain Liberation Front continued for months, ultimately leading to the arrest of over 30 suspected terrorists in 6 different countries. The intelligence gathered from Sarah's capture of the 3 hijackers proved instrumental in dismantling their entire network and preventing numerous planned attacks on civilian targets. Sarah returned to her normal duties as a Navy pilot, but her experience on Flight 447 had changed her perspective on her military service. She began volunteering with programs that supported victims of terrorism and worked with aviation security agencies to improve training for flight crews and air marshals. The remote airfield where the hijackers had planned to take Flight 447 was thoroughly investigated and then destroyed by military engineers to prevent its future use by terrorist organizations. The site became part of an expanded wilderness preserve, ensuring that it could never again serve as a base for attacks on innocent people. 2 years later, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference on aviation security, where she met many of the other passengers from Flight 447. The young mother was there with Emma, now a healthy and happy 4-year-old who had no memory of the terrifying experience. The elderly couple had become surrogate grandparents to several military families, continuing their commitment to supporting service members. Captain Martinez had retired from commercial aviation, but continued to work with the FAA on improving cockpit security procedures, often crediting Sarah's actions with teaching him new approaches to crisis management. Flight attendants Morrison and Park had both received commendations from their airline and continued their careers with enhanced training in emergency response procedures. The story of Flight 447 became a case study in military academies and law enforcement training programs, demonstrating how individual courage and training could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Sarah's tactics and decision-making were analyzed and incorporated into anti-terrorism training protocols for both military and civilian personnel. During her speech at the Aviation Security Conference, Sarah reflected on the lessons of that day. The hijackers made their first mistake when they underestimated the passengers, she said. They saw a plane load of ordinary people and assumed they would be easy victims. They didn't realize that ordinary people can be capable of extraordinary courage when they're protecting something they care about. She continued, but they made their biggest mistake when they chose my flight. Not because I was special or different from the other passengers, but because I had been given training and experience that prepared me for that moment. Every day, there are military personnel, law enforcement officers, and first responders sitting next to you on planes, in restaurants, and in neighborhoods across America. We don't wear uniforms when we're off duty, but we're always ready to serve. The hijackers had indeed made a fatal miscalculation when they targeted Flight 447. They had expected to find a plane load of helpless victims, but instead they encountered a decorated Navy SEAL pilot who turned their carefully planned operation into their worst nightmare. Their story became a reminder that those who protect and serve never truly go off duty, and that courage can emerge from the most unexpected places. Sarah concluded her speech with a simple message that resonated with everyone in the audience. The best way to defeat terrorism is to never let terrorists define who we are or how we live our lives. We honor those who serve by living freely, traveling safely, and trusting in the courage and capability of the ordinary people who do extraordinary things when their country and their fellow citizens need them most. The hijackers had learned too late that their biggest mistake wasn't underestimating one passenger. It was underestimating the character and courage of the American people who refused to be intimidated by those who would use fear as a weapon. Sarah Chun had simply been their introduction to that reality, and their last. The passengers would be questioned, medical evaluations would be conducted, and the hijackers would be turned over to federal custody for interrogation. Sarah's role was just beginning. As a military officer and the person who had neutralized the threat, she would be crucial to understanding and stopping the larger terrorist organization. As the aircraft came to a stop and the engines wound down, Sarah looked around the cabin at the faces of the people she had helped save. They were looking at her with gratitude, amazement, and respect, but also with a new understanding that ordinary-looking people could be capable of extraordinary things. The hijackers had made their fatal mistake when they chose her flight, but Sarah knew that luck had only given her the opportunity. Her years of training, her experience in combat, and her commitment to protecting innocent people had made the difference between tragedy and triumph. Sarah's mind was already working on a tactical plan. The ground team outside was expecting a coordinated evacuation under the control of the three hijackers. They probably had specific timing and procedures worked out in advance. If she could exploit that expectation, she might be able to turn the tables on the entire operation. She gathered the weapons and equipment from the three unconscious hijackers, including their radios and what appeared to be detailed maps of the airfield and surrounding area. The level of planning and preparation suggested this was a sophisticated organization with significant resources and experience. The passengers were watching her with a mixture of hope and fear, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah realized that their survival now depended on her ability to outthink and outfight an unknown number of armed terrorists while protecting over 100 innocent civilians. Outside the aircraft, she could see the ground team becoming impatient. Someone was speaking into a radio, probably trying to contact the hijackers inside the plane. Sarah had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before they realized something had gone wrong and took aggressive action. The next few minutes would determine whether this hijacking ended in tragedy or triumph, and Sarah Chun was the only thing standing between the passengers and whatever the terrorists had planned for them. The thin hijacker emerged from the cockpit once more and spoke to his companions in their unknown language. Whatever he said caused both men to nod grimly and check their weapons. Sarah's tactical instincts told her they were approaching their destination and preparing for the next phase of their operation. She realized that her time for observation and planning was almost over. Soon, She would have to act or risk losing any opportunity to stop these men from whatever they had planned. The lives of over 100 innocent people were depending on decisions she would make in the next few minutes. The plane continued its descent toward an unknown destination, while Sarah Chun prepared to transform from a seemingly helpless passenger into the highly trained warrior she really was. NG soon. If these men were planning to use the aircraft as a weapon, they would need to alter course toward their target. If they were planning to land somewhere specific, they would need to communicate with air traffic control. Either scenario would provide opportunities for intervention. The elderly woman across the aisle was now praying more audibly, her voice barely above a whisper, but clearly expressing fear and hope. Her husband held her hand with both of his face set in grim determination. Sarah realized that many of the passengers were looking to each other for comfort and strength in this terrifying situation. What none of them knew was that help was sitting just a few feet away. Sarah Chun had faced down armed terrorists in caves in Afghanistan, had survived multiple aircraft emergencies in combat zones, and had been trained by some of the best special operations instructors in the world. These hijackers had made their first and potentially fatal mistake when they chose her flight. But she also understood that her advantage was only good if she used it wisely. One mistake could cost innocent lives, including her own. The next few minutes would determine whether this hijacking succeeded or failed, and Sarah was already planning her response.